Hey, thank y'all for joining us today. I'm David Foret with the Action Group, sitting and having a conversation with Ed Shearer. You know, we've both been around since the inception of TVIB and Subchapter M. And today we're going to talk about scantlings and drawings and plans and kind of really what to look for and some different things in regards to that. So Ed?
Well, I'm Ed Shearer with the Shearer Group here in Houston. Like David said, I've been involved with TVIB from its inception, plus a few other things. We've helped develop Subchapter M, the regulations. We were involved with AWO and the Coast Guard on that. We were with the bait publication that came out about the revision of NAVIC 768, and I've probably got 40, 50 years of towboat design behind me. That makes me feel good when I drive across the bridge and see one of my boats going under it, still looking good. So I appreciate the opportunity to offer my expertise in as far as what surveyors should do under Subchapter M when they go look at a towing vessel.
Kind of really want to take you through some questions that from the engineering perspective, but we really kind of want to present it to where the surveyors in these class and kind of bring it into their understanding, okay?
Okay.
Can you walk us through kind of what that design factor looks like on the Sub-M vessel today?
Well, what you're doing is with Sub-M, you have to meet some sort of standards, even with your structure, with the welding. There's a set of rules, guidelines, whatever you want to call it, of what the boat should have in order to meet Subchapter M, included in the Subchapter M rules. And then in there too is the requirement that the boat's structural arrangement and structural plate thicknesses, framing thicknesses, things like this, meet basic ABS.
Gotcha. Okay, and that's all for new construction. That's moving forward.
And the inland service vessels are what we're looking at. It's ABS rules for building and classing steel vessels that operate on rivers and intra-coastal waterways. And that includes, as we say, is lakes, bays, and sounds.
And what part of that is applicable to the Sub-M vessels?
All of it.
All of it?
Yeah.
Okay. Vessels that don't operate on rivers and intercoastal, you know, we go to ABS rules for building and classing marine vessels. So are the hull and framing standards the same in those vessels as it would be on intercoastal?
The rules you look at for vessels not involved in inland service, your offshore tugs, things like that, there's ABS has vessels less than 90 meters long. And not to quote exactly, but I'm sure that the scantling requirements in there are a little bit heavier than what you'd find in the inland service rules, or as we call them, the river rules.
Okay. So that would kind of go, really that would be defined to address additional dynamic forces and those type of energies as put on those vessels, right?
Your offshore vessels are subject to wave action, wind action, things like this. It's a little bit more rough atmosphere out there as opposed to an inland service vessel. And
I guess if we could we kind of take a minute to kind of look back and let's take a vessel that's been in river service or built in someone's backyard, and now you're doing a Sub-M dry dock on that boat. There are no drawings, you know exactly what I mean.
Right.
So here in a minute, let's kind of walk through that process. What would a surveyor look to, and is there any guidance to make determinations on plating and scantlings and framing and those type things?
Yeah, well, once the surveyor goes through the boat, he can look and say if there's questionable areas of bulkheads, things like this. I know usually it's the four-peak bulkhead. It's usually the water laying against the bottom of it pretty well.
That's typically a fuel tank.
Yeah,
bulkhead.
typical fuel tank, yeah, that type of thing. So if there's areas that are suspect, he can go through the ABS rules. There are simple little rules for plating thicknesses based on the length of the vessel, the hull depth, the height of the vents, and the stiffener spacing. And you can go through with a calculator and come up with what is the required thickness for that particular, the side shell, the deck plate, bulkheads, and then you take 25% off of that, and that's what the thicknesses should be bare minimum. Now, and this is, you're going back through basically redesigning the boat. When the boat was built, if somebody was doing the calculations and you go through the ABS rules, you need 1.176 inch thick side plate. Well, you really can't buy that, so you're going to go with 1/4 inch, and if you're a prudent operator, we'll just use 3/8, and gee, we got a little bit extra money, and we've got a sale, so we're going to use 1/2 inch. So you're way ahead of the game now. So if you, so that's why we worked with Coast Guard to come up with the requirement that it's 25% less than the as required thickness, as opposed to as built. Because if you put 1 inch bilge plate on your boat and it gets down to 3/4 inch, you shouldn't have to change it, but that's the 25% rule. And the Coast Guard says, oh, you're right, so we'll go with the as required thickness. So it takes a little bit of calculations to find the plating. The framing inside the vessel is a different ball game, because there's no required thickness for framing, it's a required strength. And there's all kinds of formulas that you got to go through with spacings and heads. You come up with a strength requirement, and then you back into that, how thick should the item be. That's where we come in. We're doing this for a lot of boats right now, of giving the people a list of the minimum thicknesses for all their plating and all their framing.
Okay, and kind of, we're talking about the wastage, the 25% wastage, and, NAVIC 768 talks about the 25%. Can we really kind of go a little bit more in depth on the required versus as built?
When 768 came out, it just said you were allowed 25% reduction in thickness, period. They didn't say based on anything.
Mm-hmm.
The Coast Guard was using that against as built, and we had some talks with the Coast Guard, and they agreed verbally, more or less, it's as required thickness. There was a couple of documents that came out. One is repairs to tank barges, I think, something like that. The other one was, the big one was structural analyses on tank barges that are 30 years old and older. And in there it says 25% wastage on as required thicknesses. Then I was involved with AWO and the Coast Guard with this bait group, and we issued a report, and in there we said 25% below as required thicknesses, which is the calculations that you do with from ABS rules.
Okay. And so we've got the UT report, and I'm reading this UT report. How do I determine kind of like an average thickness of the vessel, and is the side shell versus the hull, is that the same, or how does that work?
Well, the calculations you do, one thickness is for the side shell, one thickness is for the bottom, one thickness is for the deck, one thickness requirement, let's put it that way, for your bulkheads and things. So your average thickness would be all the readings of the side plate grouped in, and what's your average reading? Is it well above what's the minimum required? Then you look at your deck plating. And basically what you're doing is during the survey, if you feel that there's some areas that are suspect, that's what you're looking for. Mm-hmm. You just don't go in and gauge the entire vessel. It'll probably come out showing good, but if you, like we're talking about the collision bulkhead down at the bottom, you can take a couple of shots down there and see what it looks like.
Yeah. What do you normally see as far as the UT gauges? I've heard the term belts and stuff like that. What would you normally see on a towboat hull?
What you're doing is probably 6 shots across the bottom, 3 up each side, a couple of shots on the deck, 3 shots vertically on the bulkheads. A lot of times you want to shoot. Normally fuel tanks are okay because it's a nice coating in there, but it's the bow voids, back in the stern. Do some shots back in there. Just again, it's if an area is suspect. If you look in there and there's no flange on the bottom framing, there's just heavy rust and everything. That's suspect. Go and take a look at it.
Yeah. So if I was looking at a report, how would I determine kind of like if an area is okay? If you had one reading that was lower than the others, do you average this out? Do you kind of take a look at it?
Yeah, you average all of your readings. That's a requirement. That's in the tank barge rules, which is what we're looking at here too. It's the average of all the readings.
Okay.
You may have one reading that's below what's required, but everything else is fine.
Gotcha. So we went from a towing vessel that's built to the ABS rules today, the new sub-M vessel, I guess as you would call it. And we kind of talked about the vessel was built before all this was even a thought, right?
Right.
So how do you get involved? An owner has a boat that has no plans, no drawings, no anything on it. What can that owner do to really kind of understand what piece of equipment they have from this perspective? They're picking it up on dry dock.
Well, that's when the surveyor goes in, looks at, crawls some tanks, looks at basically the length of the boat, the frame spacing, the height of the vents, things like this for your bulkhead design, things like that, and goes through a few little calculations to determine what the plating thicknesses should be on the boat with the 25% reduction. And then he goes out and if a place looks suspect, to go in and gauge it to see if it does meet the requirements or not. Most of the boats built way back when in the backyards and things like this were built fairly heavy. We just did a little boat, a little 56-foot boat, and it was amazing what it was. You know, he had 6-inch angles on the sides, and it was just like built like a bulldozer. And it was built, 40-some years ago.
Right.
And then we've also been on some boats where we've looked at some of the framing, and it would not meet ABS because it was way under design. I don't know who put it up there, but the boat's been in service for 40, 45 years, and on this particular thing, an air compressor was sitting on top of it. So I said, if it's, it's proof of the pudding. If, bumblebees from an engineering standpoint can't fly, but this was an angle on the deck that was there. I said, yeah, it's okay with me because it's proof of the pudding.
Yeah, interesting, and I think that's what industry is finding today. Now that we've gone to this regulatory climate of for credit dry dockings and just from that perspective, you find those type of things today.
Right.
You never know what you'll find whenever you pull a boat up if you're not familiar with the boat.
If the surveyor goes on the boat and finds an area that's suspect as far as framing deterioration or plating deterioration, he can do some gaugings and satisfy himself that it's okay. He can do his little calculation, but if he needs proof to the Coast Guard, that's when he calls a PE in. And what we would need from them is, if he has drawings of the boat, that just makes my day. That's perfect. But otherwise, I've either got to go up and look at the boat with a tape measure and climb through everything, look at all the framing, or I can have the surveyor go in and do dimensions for me and tell me what's there, spacings, heights, vent heights, all this other stuff, the information I need. So it's a lot of back and forth for me to get the information on this particular area or the whole boat or whatever. Then I can come up with the as required thicknesses for the particular items, the plating, the bulkheads, the framing, things like this, and furnish the owner with a letter with a PE stamp on it saying, here is your minimum thicknesses for deck, bottom, side, bulkheads, watertight bulkheads, and framing. What we do is we look at all the framing, and the worst one is what we say, this is the minimum thickness for the framing in the boat. It's up to him then to go through and do the gaugings to compare the gauging results against what my calculations are.
Right. Has that been a service that's been needed here lately?
Yes. Because we've gone through boats that are 30, 40 years old, and the only drawings they have is maybe a rudder stock, and that doesn't do me any good. And we will work with the surveyor or the owner, or I'll jump on an airplane and go somewhere and crawl through the boat.
Yeah. Let's talk about pitting for a second, because well, reviewing a UT report, and the UT report based on whether it's 3/8 or 1/2 inch, and all the readings are great. Now, I looked at a report, I think the most wastage was 10%. So I'm thinking, oh great, we're gonna go down and take a look at this vessel, and we're in good shape. I mean, it's UT report, and we got 10% wastage in one spot. And we get down there, and I mean, the pitting is amazing. There's pitting everywhere. So I guess you can't always really just determine that the UT report tells you all you need to know,
Right, right.
you know?
It's more or less a judgment call as far as is it a lot of pitting or not a lot of pitting, depending on what you're looking at. What we have also done is take gauge readings in way of the pits to see how deep are the pits. It may look bad, but when you do you've got half-inch plate and you're only, a little small amount of a pit, and then if all the pits are about that or what, it's basically a judgment call. How bad is the pitting? And bad is a undefinable word.
I think maybe if you're owner operator and you picking a boat up and pitting's identified, you probably should want to kind of go ahead and explore that further.
Right.
And kind of like what you said earlier, looking at the numbers as a whole, not as an individual number, but really kind of identify and see if that pitting is actually causing an issue.
Right.
You know, talk about exactly, well, what is kind of like the makeup of, we say pitting, wormhole. What is that?
It's basically corrosion that attacks the plate, and that's what you're looking at. It's a combination of salt water, fresh water, and of course air to get, and it's usually right around your load line. The bottoms are usually not pitted that much, but it's the band where the boat goes in and out of the water based on the fuel load and things like this.
Yeah. And you can see where pit is really just this little spot, but you can be good readings on both sides of it. Right?
Right.
You know, so going back to the UTs, the ultrasonic testing, who's allowed to do that? How does that work?
What you need is a person who is certified to do UT. We want the UT readings, and we'll also get a certificate from the guy that did the UT. If I don't know him, hey, what do you do? Use some guy that showed up with your little machine, and they're going to do it. But you have to go through some training to learn how to work these machines.
Yeah. All right. If a surveyor goes on board a vessel and doesn't have any drawings today, okay, and the plating gauges out well, no pitting, the internals, the framing, everything seems satisfactory. Is there any reason to call in a PE at that point?
In my opinion, no. If it looks good.
Yeah. I think today you have some vessels that are, the internals, voids and all were coated.
Right.
So all the framing is still intact, still good, the hulls are good, so, I guess it's that suspect area that a surveyor, if he's out there and really doesn't understand or just needs that extra assurance, would be a good phone call would be to make to you guys. Okay. What if a customer wants to just replate the hull? What would be your advice?
Replating the hull with plating that was used there, with thickness of plating that was used when the boat was actually first built, that's no problem. Going on a heavier plate, you get into problems with, does it affect the stability of the boat? Does it affect the weight of the boat, which obviously it would. There's some other factors in there. This is when there's some rules in subchapter M said if you change the weight of the vessel, you have to redo the stability, which is a bag of worms to do that. So I would say talk to the local Coast Guard that's working with you, the Coast Guard inspectors, and tell them what you're doing. Go from 3/8 to 1/2 inch on the bottom to the engine room. I don't think that's a problem, but you may have to bring in a PE to do some calculations. There is a formula in stability of vessels that you can change the weight of a boat by, I think it's 2%, if I remember right. Anyway, there's a percentage there that you can change the weight of a vessel and not have to redo all the stability. Okay. So you just have to go through and do some calculations on how much weight you're adding or taking off or whatever.
Gotcha, okay. We was looking at new construction and kind of touched on that. What would a surveyor look for in a process? PE does the design, approves the design, it goes up and gets approved by the Coast Guard. And during that call it the construction period, what would a surveyor want to see?
Well, basically, we would design the vessel, submit all, well, and stamp them with our PE stamp and send those to Coast Guard Washington. But the surveyor overseeing new construction would need a set of those plans and make sure that the vessel was being built in accordance with those plans. There may be some things left out, some little vent pipe or something like that, that he may have to go back to the naval architect, the PE, to ask him, what about this, some changes or whatever.
Yeah.
Or the shipyard may want to make some changes. Then at the end of the process, the surveyor actually writes a letter to the owner and to the Coast Guard saying, hey, this boat has been built in accordance with the plans and specifications. Sometimes the Coast Guard will want the PE to come in there and look at the boat that designed it, and he would issue the letter saying that it's been built in accordance with the plans and the specs. But either way, you need a letter at the end of the process to say this is what it is.
Saying that what the plan said is what was built.
Right.
What would you identify as critical stages that the surveyor should witness in the new construction process?
A couple of times when they're putting the hull together, when they start putting piping systems in, machinery, things like this. The big critical item is when they start doing testing of all the systems, tanks, hydrostatic testing or air testing of the tanks, things like this, just to make sure the boat's going together. And of course, the big thing is river trials.
Yeah.
When they take the boat out and see if it's going to work.
So really kind of just gauging, lack of a better phrase, but turn the page of the plans as the yard is building and kind of just make sure everything is, if it calls for a tank here, that the tank goes there, then arbitrarily be put somewhere else.
Right.
Yeah, okay. Ed, what do you think the boats today or the sub-M boats, the new build, and we talked about the plans and oversight in the yard and those type things. What would you think in regards to that boat coming up for a credit dry dock for the first time? How would you look at that boat versus, say a 40-year-old boat?
I'd look at it the same way and crawl all the tanks, make sure that everything still looks good, because boats are susceptible to damage. You can have a big knock in the hull or something like that. There may be some deterioration of say a saltwater system or something like this. So I wouldn't assume anything. I would go through it like you would any other boat.
Yeah, probably one of the first good eye look-sees that vessel's had since it came out of being built. Yeah. All right.
Because a lot of times what will happen is the vessel is built and the crew takes it, and within 5 years they've done some modifications to some of the systems and rearranged some things like this. And, the paint locker is full of not paint but other things, and the paint's sitting in the engine room, things like this.
If a surveyor went out and was used to looking at river boats, canal boats, and then went out and had a saltwater vessel that they were looking at for the first time, well, what are some of the conditions that they might encounter that they wouldn't have encountered on a inland towboat?
One thing, you probably see a lot more rust and corrosion around, like brackets for overhangs on the deck house, vent pipes, things like this, little nooks and crannies that you'd have to look into. Void compartments, salt water has probably leaked into those compartments and is laying in there, 2 or 3 inches of water sloshing around, which causes more deterioration to the metal than a brown water boat. Mm-hmm. There's probably a forward four-peak tank that they put water in just to keep the boat trimmed out. It's not ballast, it's the trim tank. So you put salt water in there, you're gonna have accelerated corrosion.
Yeah.
That type of thing.
So it definitely might appear to have a lot more wastage than it actually has.
Right.
Just from the effects of the salt water and the way it's running.
The fire pump, the other thing too, it's gonna have salt water in it. So you wanna look at the piping associated with your fire system.
Ed, we certainly appreciate you taking time and kind of sitting here and going over the, just the important piece of the whole dry dock ISC course and the things that we've been involved with. Anything like to say in parting?
No, if surveyors need to contact us, the numbers will be on the screen, and I'll be glad to help.
All right, appreciate that. Thank y'all.